The sound of tearing paper echoed across the quiet bank lobby. For a moment, nobody moved. Elias Brooks stood frozen near the polished counter, his weathered hands hanging at his sides. The 68-year-old farmer had spent most of his life under open skies, where the only sounds were wind through corn stalks and the distant hum of tractors. He wasn't a man easily shaken. Decades of droughts, storms, and hard seasons had taught him patience. But this felt different. Pieces of a $2 million check drifted toward the marble floor like fallen leaves. Behind the counter, the bank manager folded his arms and shook his head. "Nice try," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've seen fake checks before, but this one might be the most ridiculous." Several customers glanced over. Some looked away quickly. Others stared. Elias lowered his eyes to the torn pieces scattered around his boots. The check represented more than money. It carried the weight of 40 years of work, sacrifice, and promises made to people who no longer walked beside him. His late wife had believed this day would come. She used to sit on their porch swing in the evenings and tell him, "One day they'll see what you've built, Eli, one day." Now she was gone, and the dream she had shared with him seemed to be lying in pieces on a bank floor. The manager pointed toward the entrance. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to leave before I call security." A few feet away, an elderly woman waiting in line frowned. Something about the farmer's face bothered her. Not because he looked suspicious, because he looked hurt. The kind of hurt that comes from being judged before speaking. Elias slowly reached into his shirt pocket. There, tucked beside his heart, was an old photograph with worn edges. It showed a younger man, a smiling woman, and a small farm that barely survived its first year. He touched the photo gently. Then he looked back at the manager. "I understand," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger. That somehow made the scene even harder to watch. As Elias bent down to pick up the scraps of paper, the bank's front doors opened. A black SUV had just pulled into the parking lot. Inside the bank, nobody paid much attention, not yet. Because none of them knew that the man stepping through those doors was about to change everything. And none of them knew why the owner of one of the largest agricultural companies in the state always referred to Elias Brooks with a single word. "Sir, before we continue, I'd love to know something. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments." The morning had started like hundreds of other mornings in the small town of Fairview, Georgia. Before sunrise, Elias Brooks was already awake. Old habits stayed with him. Even after nearly 5 decades of farming, his body still rose with the first hint of daylight. He sat at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and looked out the window toward the fields stretching beyond the house. The farm was quiet. Rows of soybeans moved gently beneath a soft breeze. The red barn stood against the pale morning sky. Near the fence line, a few horses grazed lazily. To a stranger, it looked peaceful. To Elias, it looked like a lifetime. Every fence post held a memory. Every acre carried a story. He glanced toward the empty chair across from him. For 3 years now, nobody had sat there. His wife Lorraine had been gone since the spring. Cancer had taken her slowly, cruelly, yet somehow she had remained the strongest person in the room until the very end. Even during her final weeks, when walking became difficult, she still insisted on sitting on the porch every evening. "You know what your problem is?" she'd tease him. Elias smiled at the memory. "You never stop worrying." "Someone has to." "No," she'd say. "You've spent your whole life carrying this farm. One day, you need to let it carry you." At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. Now, sitting alone in the silence, he wished he could ask her. The kitchen clock ticked softly. On the table beside him sat a thick envelope, the same envelope he'd stared at every day for nearly 2 weeks. The check was inside, $2 million. Even after all this time, the number felt unreal. Not because he doubted it, because he knew exactly what it had cost. 42 years earlier, the Brooks family farm had been close to collapse. The bank had nearly foreclosed. Equipment was breaking down. Prices were falling. Neighbors were selling their land. Many people assumed Elias would be next. Some even told him so. "You'd be better off getting a job in town," one man had said. But Lorraine never let him quit. She believed in the farm when nobody else did. She believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Together, they survived. Year after year, storm after storm, the farm grew slowly, painfully slowly. There were no overnight successes, no lucky breaks, only long days and longer nights. Then, nearly 5 years ago, something unexpected happened. A large agricultural corporation became interested in a section of land bordering Elias's property. Geologists had discovered something valuable beneath several thousand acres across the region. Suddenly, land that nobody wanted was worth a fortune. Developers began showing up. Investors started making offers. Farmers who had struggled for decades found themselves sitting on valuable property. Some sold immediately, others held out. Elias was one of them, not because he was greedy, because he was careful. He spent years studying contracts, talking to lawyers, learning everything he could. People laughed at him. They called him stubborn. But eventually, the patience paid off. 3 months earlier, after years of negotiations, Elias signed an agreement that protected both his family land and the future of the community. The company agreed to purchase mineral rights while preserving the farm itself. The final payment? $2 million. Enough to secure the farm for future generations. Enough to create scholarships in Lorraine's name. Enough to finally breathe. The agreement had made local news. Yet Elias never sought attention. Most people in town knew him simply as the quiet farmer who helped neighbors fix fences and never missed Sunday service. That's why the bank incident felt so strange. As he drove toward town that morning, he hadn't expected trouble. The check sat safely inside the envelope on the passenger seat. The same way a farmer might transport seed before planting season. Carefully, respectfully, hopeful about what would grow from it. The bank itself wasn't new to him. He'd been banking there for years, not with large accounts, just ordinary ones. A checking account, a savings account, the occasional farm loan. The building stood near the town square, surrounded by flower beds and old brick storefronts. When Elias entered, the lobby seemed unusually busy. Customers filled several chairs. Tellers moved quickly behind their stations. A young employee greeted him politely. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." "Morning," she smiled. "What can we help you with today?" "I need to deposit this." He handed her the envelope. The young woman opened it. Her eyes widened slightly. She glanced at the check, then glanced at him, then back at the check. "One moment, please." She disappeared toward the manager's office. A few minutes later, a man in an expensive suit emerged. Gregory Whitman, branch manager, mid-50s, sharp haircut, perfect tie, the kind of man who seemed permanently annoyed. He looked at the check, then at Elias, then back at the check. Something immediately changed in his expression. Suspicion, disbelief, dismissal. "Where did you get this?" Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" "The check. It's mine." Whitman laughed, not kindly, not nervously, openly. Several customers looked over. "I'm sure it is." Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. "Sir, if there's a problem, there's definitely a problem." Whitman held the check between two fingers. "As far as I'm concerned, this thing is fake." The lobby became quiet. A woman stopped filling out a deposit slip. A teller froze. People exchanged uncomfortable looks. Elias kept his voice calm. "It's legitimate." "Do you have proof?" "The company issued it." Whitman shook his head. "People try scams every day." The farmer felt heat rise in his chest. Not because of the accusation, because nobody seemed interested in listening. Years of hard work, years of sacrifice, reduced to a glance, a judgment, a dismissal. He tried again. "The company can verify." But the manager wasn't listening. Moments later came the sound that everyone would remember. The tearing, the ripping, the destruction of the check. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Even Whitman seemed surprised by his own action. But pride wouldn't let him back down. He doubled down instead. And now Elias stood in the lobby gathering scraps from the floor. The memory of Lorraine's words echoed in his mind. "One day they'll see what you've built." The problem was that right now, nobody seemed interested in seeing anything. Then the bank doors opened. A tall man entered, accompanied by two assistants. He wore a dark blue suit and carried himself with quiet confidence. Several employees immediately recognized him. Their faces changed. The whispers started instantly, because the newcomer wasn't just another customer. He was Richard Halston, CEO of Halston Agricultural Holdings, one of the most influential businessmen in the entire state. And the name printed at the top of the destroyed check. As Halston stepped inside, his eyes immediately found the torn pieces scattered across the floor. Then he noticed Elias. The color drained from his face. For a brief moment, he looked genuinely alarmed. He walked forward quickly. The lobby watched in confusion. Nobody understood why a man worth hundreds of millions would rush toward an elderly farmer. Nobody understood why his expression suddenly looked nervous, and nobody was prepared for what he said next. "Mr. Brooks," he began. Then he stopped himself, straightened his posture, and spoke a single word, "Sir." The entire bank went silent, and Gregory Whitman felt his stomach drop. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The bank lobby seemed to shrink around Gregory Whitman. The manager's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. His shoulders stiffened. The color drained from his face. The torn pieces of the check suddenly looked very different lying across the polished floor. Richard Halston wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Elias. More specifically, he was looking at him with a level of respect that few people had ever seen from the powerful businessman. Halston stepped forward and extended his hand. "Sir, I am so sorry." The word echoed through the room. "Sir," again. Several employees exchanged confused glances. One of the tellers blinked twice, convinced she must have misunderstood what she was hearing. Elias shook his hand gently. "You don't need to apologize, Richard. But I do." Halston looked down at the shredded pieces. "Especially for this." The CEO crouched down without hesitation and began collecting the scraps himself. A billionaire kneeling on a bank floor. The sight stunned everyone. Even Elias seemed uncomfortable. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, sir," Halston replied quietly. "I do." Whitman's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced. What was happening? Why was one of the state's most successful executives treating a farmer like a distinguished guest? The answer clearly mattered, and somehow, he was the only person in the building who didn't know it. Halston carefully gathered the final pieces and handed them to one of his assistants. "We'll have a replacement issued immediately." Then he turned toward the manager. The warmth vanished from his face. "What happened here?" Nobody answered. The silence itself told part of the story. Finally, the young teller who had first greeted Elias spoke softly. "Mr. Whitman believed the check was fraudulent." Halston stared at the manager. "And," Whitman swallowed, "I made a judgment call." "A judgment call?" The words came out colder than ice. Whitman shifted nervously. "I thought it was suspicious." Halston glanced toward Elias, then back toward the manager. "What exactly looked suspicious?" No answer. The question lingered. The entire room knew the answer. And that made it even more uncomfortable. Whitman's eyes dropped toward the floor. For the first time that morning, he seemed unable to meet anyone's gaze. Meanwhile, an elderly woman sitting nearby watched the exchange carefully. She remembered the look on Elias's face when the check was torn. Not anger, not outrage, just disappointment. That memory bothered her more than anything else. Because disappointment usually comes from experience. The experience of expecting better. The experience of being let down before. Halston finally exhaled slowly. "Mr. Whitman, do you know who this man is?" Whitman looked helpless. "No, I can see that." The CEO's voice softened slightly. Then he looked around the room. "Most of you probably don't know either." The employees remained silent. "Then perhaps it's time you did." Something changed in Elias's expression. A hint of embarrassment. He clearly didn't enjoy attention. But Halston continued anyway. 24 years ago, I wasn't a CEO. The room grew still. I wasn't wealthy. He smiled faintly. I wasn't much of anything, honestly. Several people leaned closer. Even customers waiting in line seemed captivated. Halston pointed toward Elias. I was a young man who thought he knew everything. A few people chuckled softly. I had borrowed money to start my first agricultural business. Every expert told me it would succeed. His smile faded. It failed in 8 months. Nobody spoke. I lost nearly everything. The CEO's eyes drifted toward the windows, as though seeing another time. I owed money. My investors were furious. Banks wouldn't return my calls. His voice lowered. I remember sitting in my truck one afternoon, wondering how I was going to tell my wife we'd lost our savings. The room was completely silent now. Then Halston looked at Elias. I drove past this man's farm. A few employees glanced toward the farmer. I barely knew him. Elias smiled faintly. That's true. But he knew I was struggling. Halston laughed softly. I still don't know how. Small towns notice things. A few people nodded. That was true. Halston continued. He invited me inside. The CEO paused. I expected advice. He shook his head. Instead, he gave me something I couldn't believe. Whitman felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Every sentence seemed to make things worse. Mr. Brooks gave me access to part of his equipment. He introduced me to suppliers. He vouched for me when nobody else would. The CEO's eyes glistened slightly. And when I couldn't make payroll 1 month, he paused. The memory clearly still affected him. He handed me a personal check. The room remained frozen. $25,000. A teller gasped quietly. $25,000 was a tremendous amount of money today. A quarter-century ago, it was even more significant, especially for a working farmer. Elias shrugged. It wasn't that much. The room laughed softly. Halston smiled. It was everything to me. The CEO looked around the bank. You know what he asked for in return? Nobody answered. Nothing. His voice grew stronger. Not ownership. Not profit. Not recognition. Nothing. The silence felt heavier now because everyone understood what that meant. The company standing behind the $2 million check existed partly because one man had chosen kindness decades earlier. A kindness nobody had seen. A kindness nobody had celebrated. A kindness given quietly, without expectation, without applause. Halston looked toward Elias. I offered to repay him many times. The farmer smiled. You did. He refused every time. A customer near the back shook his head in amazement. The story seemed almost impossible, yet somehow it felt completely genuine. Halston nodded slowly. Eventually, I stopped offering repayment. Then a smile appeared. I started looking for other ways. Several employees exchanged curious looks. The CEO continued. When our company began acquiring mineral rights in this region, lawyers prepared standard contracts. His gaze shifted toward Elias. I threw them away. That surprised everyone. I told my team we'd create a different agreement for Mr. Brooks. Elias chuckled. We argued for months. We did. The room laughed again. But eventually we reached a deal. Halston's smile widened. A deal that protected his family farm forever. The audience inside the bank seemed to understand now. The $2 million payment wasn't charity. It wasn't a favor. It was business. Fair business. Respectful business. The kind that recognized someone's worth. Then something unexpected happened. The elderly woman waiting near the front stood up, slowly, carefully. She walked toward Elias. For a moment, nobody knew what she intended. Then she extended her hand. Thank you. The farmer looked surprised. For what? She smiled warmly. For helping someone when you didn't have to. Elias didn't know what to say. One by one, others nodded. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just quietly, respectfully. A simple acknowledgement. The kind that means more than applause. And that was when the real twist began to emerge. Because Richard Halston hadn't come to the bank that day solely because of the check. In fact, the check wasn't the main reason for his visit at all. He reached into his briefcase, removed a thick folder, and handed it to Elias. The farmer frowned. What's this? Halston smiled. It's something your wife asked me to do before she passed away. The smile vanished from Elias's face. Lorraine. The mention of her name felt like a sudden wind through an open door. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the folder. What are you talking about? Halston's expression softened. 3 months before she died, she came to see me. The room disappeared around Elias. All he could hear was his own heartbeat. She made me promise not to tell you until today. His fingers tightened around the folder. Inside it was a secret his wife had carried to her grave. A secret connected to the future of the farm. And as Elias slowly opened the cover, tears began forming in his eyes, because the first thing he saw was Lorraine's handwriting, and what she had planned would change everything. For a moment, Elias couldn't breathe. The sounds of the bank faded into the background. The conversations, the movement, the hum of the air conditioning. All of it disappeared beneath the sudden weight of seeing Lorraine's handwriting again. His fingers traced the familiar curves of her letters, the same handwriting that had once filled grocery lists, birthday cards, and little notes tucked beside his coffee cup. The same handwriting he had not seen in 3 years. A lump formed in his throat. He opened the folder. Inside rested a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in blue ink, were 4 simple words. For my Eli. His vision blurred. The room remained silent. Even Richard Halston stepped back, giving him space. Elias carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. The paper shook in his hands as he began to read. If you're reading this, then Richard finally kept his promise. A small laugh escaped him despite the tears gathering in his eyes. That sounded exactly like Lorraine, always teasing, always finding light even in difficult moments. I know you're probably standing there wondering what I've been up to. I can almost see that stubborn look on your face. Several people nearby smiled softly. Elias continued, "First, let me say something I've been trying to tell you for 45 years. His breathing slowed. You were always enough. The words struck him harder than he expected, because deep inside, there had always been a part of him that believed otherwise. A part that wondered whether he should have earned more, provided more, built more, saved more. The quiet fears that many men carried but rarely spoke aloud. You spent your whole life worrying that you weren't giving us enough. Eli, you gave us everything. You gave us honesty. You gave us kindness. You gave us a home filled with love. That's worth more than any number written on a check." A tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The bank lobby was completely still. No one seemed embarrassed by the emotion. If anything, people looked moved by it, because everyone recognized the truth in those words. Lorraine's letter continued, "Now I need you to do something difficult." Elias smiled sadly. Even now she was giving instructions. "I need you to stop carrying the world on your shoulders." His chest tightened. "You've spent decades helping everyone else. It's time to let others help you." He lowered the paper for a moment. The chair across from his kitchen table flashed into his memory. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to squeeze his hand during church services. Richard Halston quietly stepped beside him. "There's more." Elias nodded and continued reading. "A few months before I got sick, I noticed something. Every young farmer who visited our property asked you questions. They trusted you. They respected you. They learned from you." He frowned slightly. He had never thought much about it. People often stopped by. Young couples starting farms. Families struggling with loans. Teenagers looking for advice. Neighbors facing difficult decisions. He helped when he could. That was all. You may not realize it, but you've become the person others turn to when life gets hard. His eyes moved down the page. "So I asked Richard to help me create something." Elias glanced toward Halston. The CEO nodded. Then he opened another section of the folder. Inside were legal documents, official paperwork, detailed plans. Elias stared in confusion. "What is this?" Halston smiled gently. "The Lorraine Brooks Agricultural Scholarship Foundation." The room fell silent again. Elias blinked. "What?" "The foundation is already funded." His heart pounded. "Funded?" Halston nodded. "Your wife spent nearly 2 years planning it." The farmer looked stunned. 2 years. Lorraine had kept this secret for 2 years. The CEO continued. "Part of the mineral rights agreement was structured differently than you realized." Elias looked back at the paperwork. The numbers made his head spin. A portion of the company's payment had been placed into a permanent educational trust. A trust designed to help young farmers attend agricultural schools, learn modern farming methods, and keep family farms alive. The scholarship would carry Lorraine's name forever. Elias sank slowly into a nearby chair. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even process what he was seeing. The farm had always been important to Lorraine, but this was bigger than the farm. This was a legacy, a way to help families long after both of them were gone, a way to preserve something they loved. The room remained respectfully quiet. Then Halston handed him another document. This part was entirely her idea. Elias looked down. At the top of the page was another title, Brooks Family Resource Center. His brow furrowed. "What's this?" The CEO smiled. "It's an advisory center for struggling farmers." Elias looked up. "What kind of center?" "The kind where experienced farmers help younger ones navigate difficult seasons." A memory surfaced instantly, 24 years earlier. A desperate young businessman sitting at his kitchen table. A cup of coffee. A conversation. A helping hand. The same thing he had done dozens of times since. only now it would reach hundreds of families, perhaps thousands. The realization overwhelmed him. His wife had seen something in him that he never saw in himself. The bank manager stood several feet away, completely silent. Every minute seemed to make his earlier actions feel worse. But for the first time that morning, nobody was focused on him. The story had become something larger, something deeper. It was no longer about a destroyed check. It was about the quiet impact of a life lived with integrity. Eventually, Gregory Whitman stepped forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Brooks," Elias turned. The manager swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology." The room became still. Whitman looked genuinely shaken. Not because he feared consequences, because he finally understood what he had done. "I judged you." His eyes lowered. "I didn't ask questions. I didn't listen." Elias studied him carefully. The manager's voice cracked slightly. "I saw what I expected to see instead of what was actually in front of me." The honesty surprised everyone. Whitman continued, "And for that, I'm deeply sorry." The room waited. Forgiveness wasn't automatic. Real life didn't work that way. People got hurt. Trust took time. Elias remained quiet for several seconds. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately. He looked at the manager, really looked at him, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with understanding, because age had taught him something important. Sometimes people failed, sometimes badly, sometimes publicly. But most people weren't defined by their worst moment. They were defined by what they did afterward. Finally, Elias extended his hand. Whitman stared at it, surprised. Then he shook it, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Elias nodded. "Just do better next time." The simplicity of the response seemed to hit harder than any lecture could have. Several people quietly wiped their eyes. The tension that had gripped the room all morning began to ease. Yet one final challenge remained. As Halston reviewed the foundation documents with Elias, his expression suddenly became serious. There was one issue, one complication, a problem Lorraine hadn't anticipated. The Scholarship and Resource Center required leadership, someone respected by local farming families, someone people trusted, someone willing to dedicate years to guiding others. Halston already knew who should lead it. So did everyone else. The problem was that Elias Brooks had spent his entire life helping from the shadows, and accepting this role would place him at the center of something much larger than himself. For the first time all day, uncertainty crossed his face, because the future Lorraine had prepared for him required one thing he wasn't sure he could give: himself. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the bank windows, everyone waited for the answer he had not yet spoken. That afternoon, after most of the customers had left, the bank felt strangely quiet. The excitement had faded. The shock had settled. What remained was a single question hanging in the air. Would Elias Brooks accept the future Lorraine had created for him? The documents rested on the table before him. Scholarships, educational programs, mentorship opportunities, resources for struggling farming families. Everything was carefully planned. Everything was ready. Everything except one thing: the person meant to lead it. Elias stared at the pages for a long time. Outside, the town moved on with its day. Cars rolled through intersections. Store owners swept sidewalks. Children walked home from school. Life continued as it always had. But inside the bank, Elias felt as though he stood at a crossroads. Richard Halston sat quietly beside him. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't persuading. He simply waited. Finally, Elias looked up. "You know I can't do this." Halston smiled softly. "That's exactly what I expected you to say." A few people laughed, including Elias. The tension eased slightly. "I'm serious. So am I." The CEO leaned forward. "Tell me why." Elias sighed. "I'm a farmer. Yes. I've never run a foundation. True. I've never given speeches." Halston nodded. "Also true. I don't know anything about leading organizations." The CEO folded his hands. Then he asked a simple question. "Did you know anything about farming when you started?" Elias opened his mouth, then stopped. The room chuckled softly. "That's not fair." "No," Halston replied. "It's very fair." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Halston continued, "The people who need this foundation don't need a businessman." He pointed toward the paperwork. They don't need someone with fancy titles. His voice softened. They need someone they trust. The words lingered. Trust. That had always been Lorraine's gift. She could see the truth about people before they saw it themselves. Elias looked down at the letter again. One section caught his attention. He had overlooked it earlier. Slowly, he reread the final paragraph. I know you'll try to say no. You've been saying no to praise for 45 years. But this isn't about recognition. It's about purpose. The same purpose you've always had. Helping people find their feet again. His eyes filled with tears. Even now, she knew exactly what he was thinking. Across the table, Halston watched quietly. So? He asked gently. Elias laughed through the emotion. You planned this together, didn't you? For almost 2 years. That doesn't surprise me. It shouldn't. The room shared another warm laugh. For the first time all day, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Not grief, not loneliness. Purpose. A reason to look forward instead of backward. A reason to keep building. Not for himself, for others. He took a deep breath, then slowly signed the first document. The room erupted into applause. Not loud, not overwhelming, just sincere. The kind of applause people offer when they witness something meaningful. Several bank employees smiled. A few customers who had remained behind clapped quietly. Even Gregory Whitman joined in. His face still carried traces of embarrassment from earlier, but now there was something else there too. Relief. Because the day was ending differently than it began. After the paperwork was completed, Halston stood. I have one more thing. Elias immediately groaned. Oh no. The room laughed again. What now? The CEO smiled. Come outside. A strange feeling settled over Elias. The look on Halston's face reminded him of Lorraine. Whenever she planned a surprise, she wore the same expression. Half excitement, half satisfaction. Everyone followed them outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The black SUV still sat near the curb. Next to it stood a small group of people Elias hadn't noticed earlier. Men and women, young and old. Some looked familiar, others didn't. As he approached, one by one, they stepped forward. And suddenly he understood. Every person standing there had been helped by him at some point. A young farmer whose equipment had broken down years ago. A widow whose property taxes he had quietly paid during a difficult season. A couple who nearly lost their farm before he connected them with the right lender. A former employee who needed work after a family tragedy. Faces from decades of life. People he had helped and largely forgotten. Yet they had not forgotten him. The young farmer stepped forward first, though not so young anymore. His hair was beginning to gray. Elias, he said, smiling, I don't think I've ever properly thanked you. The farmer's voice cracked. When my father died, I was ready to sell everything. Elias remembered, barely. You talked me out of it. The man nodded. You didn't save my farm. He paused. You saved my family. A woman stepped forward next, then another, then another. Each carried a story. Each carried gratitude. Some spoke confidently. Others struggled through tears. One man admitted that he would have gone bankrupt without Elias's advice. Another recalled receiving a phone call at exactly the moment he needed encouragement most. Story after story unfolded. Not dramatic stories, human stories. Ordinary lives changed by small acts of kindness. The kind of acts that rarely make headlines. The kind of acts that quietly shape communities. As the stories continued, Elias became overwhelmed. He kept shaking his head. I didn't do that much. The crowd laughed. Apparently nobody agreed. Finally, an elderly woman approached. She carried something wrapped carefully in cloth. Elias frowned. What is this? She smiled. Open it. Slowly he unwrapped the bundle. Inside sat an old wooden plaque, weathered, scratched, clearly handmade. He looked confused. The woman pointed toward it. You gave that to my husband 20 years ago. Memory flashed across his mind. A struggling farmer, a difficult harvest, a conversation inside a machine shed. He remembered. Barely. The plaque carried a simple message. Good seasons don't build character. Hard seasons reveal it. His eyes filled with tears again. The woman smiled. My husband kept it beside his bed until the day he died. The crowd fell silent. Emotion washed over Elias. Because suddenly he understood something. The $2 million check wasn't the real reward. Neither was the foundation. Neither was the recognition. This was seeing the impact of a lifetime, seeing proof that kindness mattered, proof that small actions traveled farther than anyone realized. Halston stepped beside him. You spent years wondering if your life made a difference. Elias nodded slowly. The CEO gestured toward the crowd. I think you have your answer. For several moments, nobody spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. Birds sang somewhere nearby. The town seemed bathed in golden light, peaceful, quiet, beautiful. Then Halston reached into his pocket. One last thing. Elias laughed. Seriously? The crowd laughed with him. The CEO handed over a small brass key. What does this open? The old grain warehouse on Route 16. Elias frowned. The abandoned one? Not anymore. Confusion spread across his face. Halston smiled. The renovation is finished. What renovation? The one Lorraine approved before she passed. The crowd exchanged excited looks. Elias stared. The warehouse had been transformed into the future home of the Scholarship Foundation and Resource Center. Classrooms, meeting spaces, training facilities. Everything ready. Everything waiting. For him, as emotion swept through him once more, he realized something remarkable. Lorraine hadn't simply left him a gift, she had left him a future. And the next morning would be the first day of a completely new chapter. Before we move into the final part of this journey, if you've been enjoying this story and would like more heartfelt stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue sharing stories that celebrate kindness, resilience, and the people who quietly change lives. But one final piece of Lorraine's plan still remained, and it would bring Elias the kind of peace he never thought possible. The next morning, Elias Brooks arrived at the old grain warehouse just after sunrise. For years, the building had stood empty on the edge of town. Broken windows, faded paint, and rusted metal had slowly turned it into a forgotten landmark. Most people drove past without a second glance. But this morning was different. As Elias stepped out of his truck, he stopped in his tracks. The warehouse was transformed. Fresh paint covered the exterior. New windows reflected the early sunlight. Carefully planted flower beds lined the walkway. A wooden sign stood near the entrance, the Lorraine Brooks Agricultural Foundation. For a long moment, he simply stared. The sight filled him with equal parts pride and heartbreak. Lorraine should have been standing beside him. She should have been smiling at the sign, straightening his collar, and telling him not to look so serious. Instead, he stood there alone. Or at least he thought he was alone. You planning to stay out there all morning? The familiar voice made him turn. Richard Halston stood near the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. Elias smiled. You know, most people knock before giving someone a heart attack. Halston laughed and handed him a cup. Together they walked inside. The building was beautiful. Classrooms occupied one side. Meeting spaces filled another. Farming equipment displays stood neatly arranged throughout the main hall. Large photographs showed local families working their land through different generations. At the center of the room stood a framed portrait of Lorraine. She looked exactly as Elias remembered her. Warm, confident, full of life. He walked toward the photograph slowly. His fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered. For a second, his voice almost broke. Then he smiled, because somehow standing there he could almost hear her laughing. As the morning continued, guests began arriving. Young farmers, community leaders, families, students, neighbors. Many had traveled hours to attend the opening ceremony. The building filled with conversation and laughter. More than once, Elias found himself shaking hands with people he had never met. People who already knew his story. People who wanted to be part of Lorraine's dream. A few hours later, everyone gathered inside the main hall. Rows of chairs stretched across the room. The crowd settled into silence. Richard Halston stepped onto the small stage first. His speech was brief. He spoke about hard work, about integrity, about the importance of helping others without expecting anything in return. Then he stepped aside. The room applauded. Elias immediately looked uncomfortable. Public speaking had never been his strength. Halston grinned. "Your turn, sir." The crowd laughed. Slowly, Elias walked to the microphone. He looked around the room. Hundreds of faces looked back at him. For a moment, he considered reading prepared notes. Then he folded them and placed them in his pocket. He decided to speak from the heart. "You know," he began, "I've spent most of my life talking to crops. The crowd laughed warmly, so standing in front of people feels a little strange. The laughter eased his nerves. He glanced toward Lorraine's portrait, then back to the audience. I don't really know what to say. His voice softened. Except, thank you. The room became still. Thank you for being here. He paused. Thank you for believing in this. Another pause. And thank you for proving something my wife spent years trying to teach me. Several people smiled. Elias looked down briefly before continuing. She always said that kindness grows. The room listened carefully. I never understood what she meant. His eyes moved across the audience. I thought kindness was something small. His voice grew stronger. A favor, a conversation, a helping hand. He smiled. But she was right. He pointed gently toward the crowd. It grows. The room remained silent. One person helps another. That person helps someone else. And before you know it, entire communities are stronger because someone chose compassion instead of indifference. Several people wiped away tears. Elias smiled. I spent years thinking success was measured in acres, equipment, and bank accounts. His gaze drifted toward the foundation sign, visible through the doorway. But the older I get, the more I think success is measured by people. The audience erupted into applause. Not because the words were clever, because they were true. After the ceremony ended, families stayed for hours. Students toured the classrooms. Farmers shared stories. Children ran through the hallways. The building felt alive, exactly as Lorraine would have wanted. Late that afternoon, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Elias wandered outside alone. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light covered the fields surrounding the foundation. The same golden light he had watched from his porch thousands of times. He sat on a wooden bench near the entrance. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. Not because he missed Lorraine any less. He would always miss her, but grief had changed. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like love continuing its journey. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Elias reached into his shirt pocket. The old photograph was still there, the same one he carried everywhere. The younger version of himself smiled from the picture. Lorraine stood beside him. The small farm behind them looked fragile, uncertain, full of dreams. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he laughed softly. We made it, Lorraine. His eyes glistened. We really made it. The evening sky turned shades of orange and gold. Birds crossed the horizon. Somewhere nearby, a tractor hummed in the distance. Life moving forward, exactly as it should. A few minutes later, a young farmer approached the bench. Probably no older than 25. Nervous, hopeful. Mr. Brooks? Elias looked up. Yes? The young man smiled. I was wondering if I could ask your advice about something. For a moment, Elias saw himself decades earlier, uncertain, searching for answers. He scooted over on the bench. Of course. The young man sat beside him, and as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the fields, a new conversation began. Not the end of a story, the continuation of a legacy. One person helping another, just as Lorraine had always believed, just as kindness had always worked. Years later, people would remember the foundation. They would remember the scholarships. They would remember the lives that changed because of the opportunities created there. But those who knew Elias Brooks best would remember something simpler. A farmer who never measured people by their appearance. A husband who loved deeply. A man who quietly lifted others when they needed it most. And a lesson worth carrying through every season of life. The greatest wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you leave behind in the hearts of others. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Thank you for spending this time with us and being part of this journey. And as the last light settled over the fields, Elias sat beneath the evening sky, carrying his wife's photograph in one hand and her legacy in the other, finally understanding that love, when shared freely, never truly leaves. It simply finds new places to bloom.